When I was a child, I went missing in the forest for over a month. By Coureherritt. Coureherritt. Coureherritt? They never stopped searching, but they never found me. A month later, I just walked out the forest on my own. The strangest thing was, I looked perfectly okay. My clothes were clean, my body was unburdened, I was fed, and I couldn't remember anything, besides going into the forest with my grandmother. They couldn't figure out how an 8-year-old boy survived in the forest for a full month, and came back unscathed. I still remember the look of relief on my grandmother's face when she saw me. The tears streamed down her face, making me cry too. The way she held me so tightly, not wanting to lose me again. I went to therapy after that, but no matter how much they tried to jog my memory, it remained empty. There was no real trauma to my mind, and so shortly after, I stopped going. I moved on from this strange experience, not able to fully grasp the impossibility of what had happened at that young age. But I'm older now, and even though I cannot remember it, I can understand just how scared my grandmother must have been. But I'm not here to tell you a story about something that I cannot remember. I started remembering recently. 2 days ago, I struck up a conversation with my grandmother about the odd event. I asked her, "Do you remember when I went missing for a month?" Her expression instantly grew grim, and she looked at me with this intensity in her eyes. Despite her old age, my grandmother was a fierce woman. "I remember," she said in a hushed whisper, her gaze dropping down to my feet. "I started having dreams of the forest," I told her truthfully. She looked back up at me again, her eyes showing a glint of surprise. "Dreams?" She asked me to elaborate. "Yes, I'm always walking in them. The forest is all around me. I can hear sounds, leaves crunching, branches snapping, and birds chirping. I can feel the warmth of the sun on my skin." My grandmother listens intently. I can see her tapping her fingers on the chair in a nervous tick. Then the forest slowly grows silent. First the chirping, then the trees swaying, leaves crunching, branches snapping. The sun disappears too, and it grows dark. But I continue walking, and each time, I end up in front of a staircase. I get the chills just thinking about the staircase. A staircase? It's always in perfect condition, untouched by Mother Nature. It looks like the staircase had been taken straight out of the house, but they lead to nowhere. It's a different one in each dream. Some are old, some are modern. My dream ends the moment I take the first step. My grandmother sighs loudly. It's not a sigh of relief. It's more like she's sighing because a burden has been taken off her shoulders. "Do you know how you went missing?" she asks me. "No," I admit. "One day you were playing outside in the backyard, like you always did. I was in the kitchen making lunch." She looks at a picture beside her on a dresser. It's a picture of us both, taken when I was 7. She picks it up and continues speaking. "I always taught you and reminded you not to wander off into the forest. But despite that, I still kept my eye on you through the windows." "So I wandered off?" My grandmother chuckles. "No. I wish that was what had happened instead." She places the picture back and takes a deep breath. "I was watching you play with some sticks, having completely forgotten the potatoes that I was cooking. The water started running over the top, and I ran over to clean up. It only took a minute or two. When I was back at the window, her lips and hands were trembling, and she took hold of her armrests. I swallowed the saliva that had collected at the top of my mouth. I saw you walking into the forest, but you weren't alone. I saw myself, holding your hand, walking into the forest." She began tearing up. "I ran after you. I screamed and shouted and looked for you. But the moment you entered the forest, it was like you simply disappeared." My hands began trembling too, the memory of walking into the forest with my grandmother tugging at my mind. I stood and walked over to my grandmother to hold her. "It wasn't your fault," I said. She cried in my arms. I cried too. After a while, we calmed down and began talking again. What was it that took me? I questioned her. I thought it was a skinwalker at first, she answered, wiping her nose with a tissue. But if it were a skinwalker, you wouldn't have returned alive. You wouldn't have returned at all. So I don't know what took you, but I'm glad you returned. I wouldn't have been able to bear losing you too, like I lost your parents. I squeezed her hand I still held tightly, and smiled at her. Not wanting to stress my grandmother anymore, I dropped the topic. Shortly after, I drove home. I had a dream that night. It was the same dream, but something was different. In my previous dreams, I was always alone, but in this dream, I felt a presence with me. No matter how hard I looked, I couldn't see it, but I knew it was there. It didn't feel like it wanted to harm me, but it didn't feel like it wanted to help me either. When I got to the stairs, this time I recognized them. I had seen these stairs before, but I couldn't remember where. There were only 6 steps, and unlike the rest, the stairs looked old and abandoned. They were wooden, but they had begun rotting. When my feet moved to step onto them, I felt a strong hand on my shoulder, and the dream ended before I took that step. Once I woke up, I remembered where I'd seen them. They belonged to an old cabin in the woods. The cabin was maybe a mile out from my grandmother's house, and I decided to go for a hike. I informed my wife that I'd be gone for the majority of the day, and apologized to my 6-year-old for leaving so early during the holidays. Today was a Thursday. My grandmother wasn't a fan of my idea to go out alone, so she decided to accompany me. She knew this forest like the back of her hand, so having her come along was reassuring. But her back is bad, so I also wish she'd stayed behind. But there was no convincing her otherwise. The hike took a little under an hour, and we ended up at the cabin, or what was left of it. The entire wooden structure had collapsed onto itself. "Did you know about this?" I asked my grandmother. "No, I haven't been here for years. You know, I don't think this is where you were for that entire month. We looked here, almost every day." I nodded in agreement. Still, maybe I had some clues. My grandmother sighed and sat down on the mossy ground. "You can look around," she motioned with her hand. "Be careful." Despite me already being a grown adult, she still worries. I chuckled to myself. I moved around some of the smaller pieces of the collapsed house to take a better look at it as a whole. Come to think of it, I remember this being a single-story cabin. So why do I remember a staircase? How could a staircase be used here? And then it clicked. A basement. "Do you remember a basement in this cabin?" I yelled over to my grandmother. "No, why?" Oh, I grinned. She figured it out as well. She walked over to where I was, and I began trying to move some of the heavier pieces around. Even if the house collapsed, the foundations were strong, and the basement should still be there. After about half an hour, I finally found a broken floorboard revealing not dirt or moss, but darkness below it. I began trying to pull it out and break it in. After a while, the hole was big enough to look inside. I pulled out my smartphone and turned on the flash. The smell coming from inside was putrid. I couldn't begin to describe what it smelled like. What I saw inside made my blood run cold. Shelves with glass jars, a white liquid inside of them. Inside the liquid were body parts. Eyes, ears, fingers, organs, and everything in between. Opposite the shelves was a pile of bodies. Some were rotten beyond recognition. Some were skeletons, while others looked fresh. Next to the bodies, I saw a staircase. The staircase from my dreams. I remember it vividly, walking down these steps. I pulled my head out and puked on the spot. "What? What is it?" my grandmother asked. "Let's get out of here and call the police." We began walking in the direction that we came from. There were dead bodies, skeletons, organs. I couldn't even begin describing what I saw to my grandmother. "Dear God," is all she could mutter out. I called the police once we got back to her house and had to guide them to the collapsed building. The younger policeman puked when he got a whiff of the smell of the dead bodies. Something clicked in me then, watching those 2 policemen stand around, holding their noses. I remembered. My grandmother took me to this house that day I went missing. or whoever was posing as her. She took me down those steps into the basement. There were no dead bodies back then, and the shelves were empty. She gave me some mushroom soup to eat, after which I dozed off. I woke up, tied to a wooden table in the dark basement. My clothes were gone, and it was cold, and I felt a stinging pain in my chest. Despite my best efforts, I couldn't even lift my head. I had no energy. I remember crying then. After my tears dried out, and I regained some energy, I suddenly heard some shuffling above. "Are you here, Mark? Mark, where are you?" People were looking for me. I heard footsteps above me. A woman sighed. "He's not here." "No. Let's go." I tried to scream and shout for help, but nothing came from it. That's the last thing that I remember, my desperate attempts to cry for help. "Mark?" the younger policeman spoke, breaking me out of my daze. "Huh? Yeah," I asked, blinking a couple of times. "Are you okay?" "Yeah, I just remembered something suddenly," I answered, truthfully. The policeman nodded and walked back to his partner. I took a deep breath and looked around the forest. Thinking about it, it was a creepy place. For some reason, I had the feeling that we were being watched. I couldn't shake it off. Someone was watching us. "Okay, let's head back. We call them backup. This is beyond us two." I nodded and followed the policeman out the forest. The feeling of being watched didn't disappear until we were out. I hugged my grandmother goodbye and went home that day. I told my wife everything that happened and what we found. She was mortified. I had another dream last night. It was completely different from the rest. I was no longer walking in the forest. I was in the basement of that cabin. I could hear footsteps above. For some reason, those footsteps scared me a lot. I was trembling in fear. Eventually, I heard them leave the cabin and relaxed. Then I heard a new pair of footsteps enter. They were lighter, smaller. The secret door to the basement suddenly opened, and I saw a disheveled boy with messy brown hair and torn clothes smile at me. "Let's go." I woke up after that. I couldn't remember his face, only his long messy hair and his smile. Who is he? I don't know why I'm starting to remember these things now. I don't know what happened to me during that month I spent in the forest, or why I forgot everything. But I want to know. I want to find out. I'll be going back to the forest today to see if I remember anything else. I'll post an update once I figure out something new.